It's my real pleasure to introduce to you Dean Vincent Poor. And if you look at the front of the podium here, you'll see that we are in his school. This is the School of Engineering and Applied Science, and he welcomes us, and we are very thankful for his participation and his cooperation over many years of doing courses here. Vince Poor is the dean of the school, where he is also the Michael Henry Strater University Professor of Electrical Engineering. He got his PhD in electrical engineering and computer sciences way back in computer science history in 1977 here at Princeton. He taught at the University of Illinois at the Champaign-Urbana campus before joining the Princeton faculty in 1990. He was appointed dean of the school, of the engineering school in 2006, so now 7.5, 8 years almost of us being dean here. He's also held visiting appointments at several wonderful other universities internationally. They include, starting here at home, Harvard, Stanford, but also the Imperial College of London and elsewhere. Vince's research and teaching interests are primarily in the area of wireless networking and related fields. As the dean here, he is responsible for leadership of the school, which comprises 6 different academic departments and several major research centers, and involves over 20% of the entire Princeton students and 40% of its research expenditures. Vince is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and National Academy of Sciences. He is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Academy of Engineering of the UK, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He is a former president of IEEE Information Theory Society and a former editor-in-chief of the IEEE Transactions on Information Theory. His contributions to the field have been recognized with a number of awards and fellowships, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2002. Last year, he received a Royal Academy Distinguished Visiting Fellowship, and he has received honorary doctorates from several universities in Europe and Asia. As part of our celebration, as you know, we have been giving one of these priceless Princeton Double Skull t-shirts, and it's my pleasure to give to Vince, feeding his curiosity and our curiosity. So, without any further ado, the topic of tonight's discussion is Princeton and the dawn of the information age. Please join me in welcoming Dean Vincent Poor.
Thank you for that great introduction. You should have waited till the end to give me the t-shirt, because that's really the only reason I'm here. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the weather to come out tonight. You know, this is Thanksgiving week, and we all have things we're thankful for. And one of the things I'm thankful for is that Mark put me on the program before Paul Muldoon, because he's an outstanding speaker, as you'll see next week. So I've been on the program with him before, always fortunately before him. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. This is, I think, the second time I've had the opportunity to speak in this series. But much more frequently, I've been a consumer. I've been in the audience in this series and also many others, even back in the day when this series was offered in the Princeton High School auditorium. So it's a particular pleasure to be here. Now, as some of the other speakers have said, when Mark invited me to give this talk, my marching orders were essentially to talk about something or someone that had a major influence on me or my field, and the only requirement was that it had to be something that happened in the last 75 years. So, which is not a very narrow portfolio of opportunities to speak about. So, in thinking about this talk, I tried to narrow it down a bit from that, and I looked first of all at my field, information, basically, which is information science and technology broadly. And of course, we have the 75-year window of the lifetime of the Princeton Adult School. So I thought I'd look back at what was happening in my field 75 years ago, or thereabouts. And also, I wanted to focus on Princeton because we live in Princeton, this is where we are. And so I wanted to look at that intersection. And it turns out that that's a very fortuitous intersection because at that time, roughly 75 years ago, in Princeton, there were 3 people working who are among the giants of the field of information science and technology. Those are Alan Turing, John von Neumann, and Claude Shannon. So I decided I would focus my talk on those 3 people. And generally, I want to talk about connections between Princeton in the large, not just Princeton University, Princetonians, and developments in information sciences. I'm going to focus on that time period, and particularly on those 3 great people, Turing, von Neumann, and Shannon. But I want to put things in greater context, so I'm going to spend some time, first of all, motivating with a particular example what I'm going to talk about tonight. And also, I'm going to give a brief timeline in general of Princeton's connections to this field. So that's the program of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I should just say that if I were to pick one person here, I would have picked Claude Shannon. In my particular field, he's probably the most influential figure. But I did want to talk about these others because they're certainly well known and certainly have been very influential in the broader field of computer and information technology. So in the title of my talk, I used the term information age. So I thought I better look it up before I gave a talk on it. And I looked in the Oxford English Dictionary, and this is the definition they give. The era in which the retrieval, management, and transmission of information is a principal activity. So I think we certainly live in the information age now. It turns out that this term was coined by this person, Richard Leghorn, and it was first written down, at least according to the OED, in this book, Top Management Handbook, which was published in 1960. And this book is in the Princeton University Library, and I looked it up. And it turns out that he just uses that term as sort of a postscript at the end of an article about computing resources and computing technology in management. But nevertheless, he gets credit for coining it. This is a picture of Richard Leghorn. I picked this particular one because he shows him holding a camera. And the reason is he was a reconnaissance pilot in World War II. And this is the type of camera that they used. And I read a little bit about him, and it turns out that he started, after the war, he started a company building those cameras and became quite wealthy. So that's his story. But nevertheless, probably his biggest claim to fame is having coined the term information age. Of course, information technology really affects many activities, or many aspects of human activity, maybe most, for better or for worse. So it's really too broad of a field for me to talk about in 1 hour. So I want to focus down on one of the most pervasive elements of information technology, which is the cell phone. The cell phone is probably the most pervasive technology in the world. The UN, this is the International Telecommunications Union, which is part of the UN, estimates that about 6 billion people have access to a cell phone. And to put that in context, there's only about 7 billion people in the world. This is almost everybody. Okay, aside from the spare billion people there that don't have access, but this is pretty much one of the most pervasive technologies in the world. More pervasive than electricity, if you can believe it. So I'm going to focus on the cell phone, and then again, just to give some context, I'll talk about smartphone. So, smartphone like this. So, first of all, what is a smartphone? Well, it's not just a phone. Of course, it is a phone. It's a telephone, but it's also a computer. It's probably the most common kind of computer in the world. It's also a messaging system. You can send text messages and so forth. It's a web browser, a camera, an organizer, has a calendar, clock, and so forth. It's a media player. We can play music and videos through it and so forth and so on. So in this little device is packed a lot of technology. Almost any part of information technology you can think about has some version in in this little device. So that's what it is. That's what we care about. But let's talk about what makes it work. And again, there's a lot of things that make it work, but I'm just going to talk about a few. And you'll see a lot of alphabet soup up here. And I don't normally put those kind of things in a talk like this, but I have them there for a reason, which you'll see later. So first of all, the basic element in here is a transistor. Okay, and I asked my colleague Jim Sturm, who's an electronic devices guy in my department, when I was getting ready for this talk, I said, how many transistors do you think are in here? So he did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and he came up with about 100 billion. And he said it could be maybe a trillion. Okay. Now, these are not big transistors. These are about 20 nanometers by 20 nanometers. They're very, very tiny. And they're organized in integrated circuits, ICs, using a technology called CMOS, complementary metal oxide semiconductor technology. So this is how they're manufactured into integrated circuits. Those integrated circuits are electronic devices. They run software. They're algorithms for doing various tasks on your computer, and it's all governed by an operating system. There's also wireless technology, of course. It's a cell phone, so there's wireless in there. And one of those technologies, the primary one, is something called OFDM, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. Okay, we'll come back to that later. There's going to be a test at the end. There's also a display, of course. You can see if it doesn't break when you drop it, fortunately. Display, and that display uses something called a liquid crystal display. That's what it's made of. There's imaging technology. There's a camera in here, right? It uses something called charge-coupled devices. That's the devices that capture the image. This one actually has a new technology called CMOS sensors, but most of them have charge-coupled devices. And it has a memory, a flash memory, okay? And, it also has networking protocols because you can use it on Wi-Fi, on the internet. So on the internet, there's a protocol called TCP/IP. This stands for Transfer Control Protocol, Internet Protocol. That's the main set of rules. A protocol is just a set of rules governing traffic, and that's the main rules that govern the traffic on the internet. There are also services associated with this device, search like Google, e-commerce, and so forth. There's also intellectual property in here. There's a lot of intellectual property in here. The iPhone has just in terms of Apple intellectual property, it has 200 Apple patents associated with this device, but that's hardly a fraction of the total amount of intellectual property that goes into this. This runs on 4G, so-called 4G, and the estimate of the number of patents associated with 4G is about 34,000. So there's a lot of intellectual property in here, okay? And there's a lot of other stuff as well, okay? So just bear this in mind as we're going through this talk. And don't forget all those acronyms. Okay, so now I'm going to spend about the first half of the talk, or half of the remaining part of the talk, giving a sort of a timeline of Princeton and Princetonians and their involvement in the development of some of the technologies that are in this device. And this is very selective because there's an enormous contribution of Princeton and Princetonians to these technologies. So I'm going to have to be very, very selective. So if I don't mention your favorite Princetonian who might have done something in this, please don't be offended because I had to be very selective here. All right, so Princeton was founded in the 1860s. It wasn't a scientific school in those days. Electricity had hardly been invented. But there is an important person, Princetonian, who had something to do with this, okay? And that's James Madison, Princeton graduate. He was also the first graduate student at Princeton. And he was one of the crafters of the Constitution. And the Constitution embodies the patent system. So patent rights to inventors are embodied in the U.S. Constitution. So intellectual property, or the ability of inventors to benefit from their inventions, is a very important part of technology development, and that's, for us, embodied in the patent system. The English legal system also had patenting at this time, which had a lot to do with why the Industrial Revolution was able to start in England. it, though. There wasn't a lot of scientific study at Princeton at that time. It was mostly a school for preachers. But in the 19th century, a very important scientist came to Princeton, Joseph Henry. He was a faculty member here in the first half of the 19th century. Today, we would call him something like something between a physicist and an electrical engineer. We didn't have those terms back in the 19th century. He was a natural philosopher. But one of the things he did, among many, was to perfect the electromagnet. And this influenced two important figures in the development of information technology, namely Morse, who developed the telegraph, and Bell, who developed the telephone. Okay. Now, Henry lived in this house, which is over by Nassau Hall, Joseph Henry House. Very clever name. And his office was in Philosophical Hall, which is now Chancellor Green. They tore that building down, so just next to Nassau Hall. And he built the telegraph himself before Morse's telegraph between Philosophical Hall and this house in order to signal his household when he was coming home for lunch. So anyway, he's a giant of American science and a very important person in Princeton history. I'll mention another 19th century figure here. It's in the second half of the 19th century, and that's Cyrus Brackett, who was sort of the successor to Joseph Henry. In fact, he was the Joseph Henry professor here. And I'll just mention a couple things about him. He founded at Princeton the first school of electrical engineering in the United States. So Princeton has the oldest electrical engineering school in the United States. This is very influential. We'll see later people who graduated from this school, who now department, who had a lot to do with the cell phone. One of the other graduates of this school, an early one, was Edgar Palmer, who developed Palmer Square, and for whom Palmer Stadium is named. So he was a philanthropist and graduate of this program, one of the early ones. Brackett also influenced Edison, and he testified on Bell's side in the Bell patent litigation, which allowed him to retain his patent and then, of course, develop the telephone into an industry, AT&T. So that's really it for the 19th century. In the early 20th century, again, there were a number of people, but I'm only going to talk about two, just in the interest of time. One of them is a guy named John Renshaw Carson, who got a bachelor's degree here. He graduated in that EE program that Brackett set up. Got a master's. He taught here 100 years ago today. He was teaching at Princeton. He then went to the predecessor of Bell Labs. He invented something called single sideband modulation. Okay, now, I know everybody knows what that is, but I'm going to explain it anyway. I'm not really going to explain it, but basically, it's a type of amplitude modulation. So like you having AM radio, it's a type of amplitude modulation, but it basically allowed the carrying of telephone calls by radio, so-called radio telephone. So before this, all telephone calls were made over wireline. So this is really a predecessor, if you will, of this, which is a radio telephone. Okay? It doesn't use single sideband, but it does use FM, or at least this one doesn't, but an early version of this did. The first versions of generation cell phones use FM. And Carson also had a lot to do with FM, even though he didn't invent it, but he studied it and its properties and helped engineers understand how to design FM systems. One of the things that he had a very direct impact on is this facility, which also has a Princeton connection. So this is, some of you may know about this, but over at the corner of Blackwell and Cold Soil Road, there's a park. It's called Mercer Park West, Mercer County Park West, and part of it is called the Pole Farm, which was owned by the phone company many years ago. And on that property was this facility, which was the main transmitter for radio telephone between North America and Europe from 1929 when it was built all the way into the 1950s when the first undersea telephone cable was laid to Europe. So there was an undersea telegraph cable laid many, many years earlier, but telephone had to go through this. Okay? This was actually still in operation in the 1970s, not carry radio telephone to Europe, but to carry it to Cuba. Okay, it finally was closed down in the early 70s. You can go out there, they tore the buildings down, but you can still go out there and see the remnants of this. This is a picture of Carson. He was one of twins, both of whom were Princeton students, and this one is him. Another pre-1930 figure is Alonzo Church, who was a mathematician. He got both his bachelor's and PhD here and taught on the faculty for many years. And I mention him here because he was Alan Turing's PhD advisor. And he was working on things similar to Turing. He's kind of an unsung hero of computing, but he was very influential in some of Turing's ideas. And I love this picture of him. Who knows what was happening. In the 1930s, things really started to heat up. These are some Princeton PhD students who were here in the 1930s and had a very important impacts on information technology. John Bardeen, who went on to invent the transistor. He left Princeton, went to Bell Labs, and shared in the Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor. Later won the second Nobel Prize, so one of the few people to have 2 Nobel Prizes in physics. Alan Turing, who got his PhD in math here. This is 1937, but I think it should be 1938, actually. I'm going to say more about him later. And I'll mention John Tukey. John Tukey, some of you may have known John Tukey, another mathematician. He introduced something, many things. He introduced a technique, it's really an algorithm called a fast Fourier transform. Okay, again, I'm sure you all know exactly what this is. But basically, it's a method for converting a signal into its, decomposing a signal into its frequency components. And that's what the Fourier transform is. And the fast Fourier transform is a very fast way, being computationally efficient way of doing that. Okay? Now, that's in here. Okay? Everybody's cell phone has one of those in it because that's the technology that allows OFDM, remember that from the earlier slide, to work. Okay? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to efficiently do receiving and transmitting of OFDM. Okay? So this development is very important to this device. Incidentally, the person who discovered that is that the fast Fourier transform was useful in OFDM, was a guy named Steve Weinstein, who lived in Princeton too, worked at NEC Labs for many years. Tukey also coined the term bit, so that's another thing we use all the time. And some say he coined the word software, but I can't, the OED wouldn't credit him with it, so I put a question mark by it, just let me say. He looks like Orson Welles, doesn't he? At first I thought that was Orson Welles. It's him, because you can see the chalkboard behind him. He's also one of the founding figures of statistics, so if you hear about big data, that kind of thing, it's very important today. Tukey was a very influential statistician. I was very fortunate to know both Bardeen and Tukey. John Bardeen was a colleague of mine at Illinois in the electrical engineering department till his retirement, and Tukey was here. He was a professor when I was a student, and then when I came back as a professor, he had already retired, but he was still around campus, so I was able to interact with him then. Turing I never met. Another very important event of the 1930s was the founding of the Institute for Advanced Study. Now we know it's on a campus over there, on the other side of the township, the old township. I guess not the township anymore. But in 1930, it was in this building, which is now called Jones Hall. It's over by the Frisch Student Center. It was then called Fine Hall, so that name was moved to the new Fine Hall. And this is the building that housed not only the Institute, but also housed the math department. So this is also where Turing would have worked as well, and Tukey. John von Neumann, who I'm going to talk about a bit more later, came to be a Princeton faculty member in the early 30s, and then joined the Institute for most of the rest of his life. Okay, and again, I'm going to talk more about him later. Claude Shannon also joined the Institute for Advanced Study in 1941, and again, I'm going to talk more about that later. information technology, at least in terms of Princeton, as far as Princeton is concerned, was the move of RCA Labs to Princeton. Later to be known as Sarnoff Lab, went through a few name changes, and now it's called Sarnoff Corporation. This is David Sarnoff here. I think he was the CEO of RCA at the time. This is an official from the labs. I don't remember his name, but this is the groundbreaking out on Route 1 for RCA Labs in 1942. Many things were developed, have been developed, and continue to be developed out there. I'll just mention three of them. You remember these terms: liquid crystal display from the 1960s, CMOS manufacturing in the late 60s and early 70s. Remember, this is the technology that allows us to put lots of integrated circuits, lots of transistors on an integrated circuit. And also commercial CCD arrays. Okay, so CMOS wasn't invented there, it was invented at Fairchild Semiconductor, but they invented the process for making it into ICs. And the charge-coupled device was not invented there either, it was invented at Bell Labs, at this time already in New Jersey. But they're the ones who made this into a commercial product like we have in our cameras today. I'm about to wrap this up, and then I'll talk more about the three greats. But this is a good segue into another group of Princeton students who were all very important inventors of the information age. The first is, I mentioned that the liquid crystal display was developed at RCA, and the person who invented it is George Heilmeyer. This is George. He got his PhD in electrical engineering in 1962 here at Princeton, and he then went to RCA Labs for most of his career, and he invented the LCD. He's won many awards for his work. He's still around. Bob Kahn also got his PhD in electrical engineering a couple years later. Bob Kahn is one of the co-inventors with Vint Cerf of the TCP/IP protocols. Remember, these are the protocols that run the internet. So he's considered to be one of the inventors of the internet. This is Bob right here. This is a team of people that were working on computer networking at that time at BBN in Boston. And just this year, Bob, together with Vint and others, were given the first Queen Elizabeth Prize, which is a £1 billion prize given by Queen Elizabeth for engineering advances. And this is the first one that was given, and he got it, one of the people who got it. Another person from that era, also an electrical engineering PhD, later in the decade, is Brian Kernahan. Brian is, I couldn't find an older picture of Brian, but he is currently a faculty member here in computer science. He went to Bell Labs after getting his PhD, and he's one of the co-developers of the so-called Unix operating system. So remember, I mentioned you have to have an operating system to run this. Unix was a very influential operating system, I should say, but it's also the predecessor of Linux, which is the open source version, and OS X, which is the Macintosh operating system, and also iOS, which is what runs on this device. Another electrical engineering student at Princeton, this from the early 70s, is David Boggs. This is him here. You can see the difference between the early 60s and the early 70s, and also between the East Coast and the West Coast. David worked at Xerox PARC in Palo Alto, and there he invented, he's one of the co-inventors of the Ethernet protocol, which is a protocol for local area networking. So if you have an Ethernet port on your computer and you plug into it, you're running the Ethernet protocol. Now, this is not a wireless protocol, but it is the predecessor of the protocols we use for Wi-Fi. Okay, so Wi-Fi has different set of protocols, but they're derived from the same principles as Ethernet. Now, continuing in the 70s and into the into the 80s, I'll mention some entrepreneurs, and one of them is sort of a bridge between the inventors and the entrepreneurs, and that's Eli Harari, who got his PhD at Princeton in AMS, which is aerospace, was a department called Aerospace and Mechanical Sciences. Now it's called Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. But he invented something in his PhD dissertation, something called floating gate EEPROM. This is erasable, programmable, read-only memory. And EEPROM is basically what flash memory is made of. So the flash memory card in your camera, if you have a thumb drive for your computer, those kind of memories are flash memory. And he basically invented one of the main technologies behind flash memory. And then he took it to town. He founded a company, SanDisk. It was called SunDisk first. He changed it to SanDisk and became the CEO of that company. This is Ellie here. Also couldn't find a picture of him in his early days. Another student here at that time in the 70s was Eric Schmidt. Got his degree in electrical engineering in 1976. Of course, he became CEO of Google and is the current chair. Also Meg Whitman, economics, bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton. And she's the former CEO of eBay and the current CEO of Hewlett Packard. And then Jeff, this is the last person I'm going to talk about. This is the 1980s now. Jeff Bezos, who got his degree in EECS here. And he's the founder and CEO of Amazon.com. So I mentioned these particular people. There are many others, of course, who founded companies and become leaders and so forth. But I mentioned these because, first of all, these are some of the biggest companies in the internet world or in the computing world. And also, these are the CEOs that brought these companies to public. So these were startup companies. When they went, they made them public. So they're responsible, largely responsible for the success of these companies. Of course, Bezos and Harari are founders as well. Okay, so now that should set the stage for what I'm going to talk about now, which is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these three greats, okay, Turing, von Neumann, and Shannon. And what I'm going to do, I'll talk a little bit about their early life, I'll say a little bit about why they're important, and then I'll say a little bit about their later life. So I'll try to keep it brief in each case. So we'll start out with Turing. Okay, Turing is English. He was born in London in 1912, so last year was his centennial. We had a big party here, 3-day symposium, lots of things, dinners and so forth, celebrating that. His father was he was a British civil servant in India, but he came back and Turing was actually born in London. He went to Cambridge, Cambridge, got his bachelor's degree in math, and was immediately elected a fellow of King's Cambridge. So this is unusual because usually this might be something that would happen to you later in your career, but he was apparently very precocious scholar and became immediately a fellow of King's. At Cambridge, he wrote a very influential paper, a paper that was eventually very influential, on computable numbers with applications to the Entscheidungs problem, which means decision problem in German. This was one of the so-called Hilbert problems. It was a fundamental problem in mathematics, but in the course of addressing this problem, he introduced something which came to be known as the universal Turing machine, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. In 1936, the same year, he published his paper, which, by the way, was published in the Proceedings of the London Mathematical Society. He came to Princeton to study with Alonzo Church. So you remember I mentioned him. He was a professor here. Alonzo Church had been working on similar ideas, different but similar. He was working on the same problem, and Turing wanted to come work with him. So he came for a year. He got here, decided to stay another year, and eventually got a PhD. So in 1938, he got his PhD. He wrote a thesis that basically generalized the Turing machine, and then he went back to Cambridge. This is where he lived when he lived at Princeton. That's the graduate college. So what did Turing do? Well, first of all, Turing did not invent computers. There were already computers in his lifetime, in his early days, been computers for many, many years. But those computers were special purpose computers. They were designed to do particular things. They weren't programmable. Most of them they weren't electronic either. They were mostly mechanical computers, and they were analog primarily. Okay, so he didn't invent computers at all, but he did introduce a very important notion, which is that of, as I said, a universal computing machine, which is a program, even though it says machine, it's not hardware, that can implement any kind of computation that can be written in algorithmic form, a recipe of steps, computational steps. So what does it consist of? Well, it's simple. It's a memory or a tape that has symbols stored on it. The tape can move backwards and forwards. There's a read-write head that can read the symbols and write off the tape and write onto the tape. And then there's a processor, which is some kind of a machine that takes symbols in, processes them, and puts new symbols out. So basically, you read what's on the tape, you process it somehow, and you write a new symbol onto the tape. That's all it is. Very simple idea. Okay, but it's deceptively very simple because it can be adapted to simulate the action of any computer algorithm. Okay, and for that reason, it can help determine the extent and limitations of what can be computed. Okay, and this is why he was interested in it for Hilbert's problem, because that's really what that problem is about, what could be determined from certain axioms and so forth. Now, again, it's a very simple idea, and Turing was really studying this problem in the context of an abstract mathematical problem, but it turned out to be extremely influential in computer science. And this machine, as simple as it is the basis for much computer science theory. Well, when he got back to England, Turing went back to Cambridge and started working part-time at the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park. And this was the build-up to World War II, so there was a lot of thinking about wartime things, including decryption of enemy codes. When war broke out, he went to work there full-time, where he was working on breaking the German naval cipher machine Enigma. He specified the architecture of the so-called bomb machines, which were they were computers, special purpose computers, not all electronic, they had some mechanical features too, that contributed to the breaking of the Enigma machine. So it was very important in the Battle of the Atlantic. He also contributed to cryptanalysis. He wrote papers there on cryptanalysis, and some of them were only declassified last year at his centennial. Okay, so they kept them classified for 70 years. That's how important they thought they were. He got an OBE for this in his early 30s. Then, after the war, he moved to London, where he designed the UK's first electronic stored program computer. So, up until this point, most computers had been, as I said, special purpose computers. They were built to do a particular type of computation. A stored program computer, which the Turing machine sort of gives you an idea of how you might do it, is one we're familiar with today, where it's a general purpose computer. You can program it to do different things. One day you program it to do one thing, another day you program it to do something else. So this was the first UK stored program computer. He didn't stay to see this completed. He moved on to academia, to Manchester University, where he worked on further computer designs and also on mathematical biology. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. This is the photograph from that election. And then, very sadly, Alan Turing was gay. There were laws, very oppressive laws, anti-homosexual laws in the UK at that time. He ran afoul of those, and eventually he committed suicide. He was only 41 years old. In 2009, Gordon Brown issued a formal apology to Turing. And now, I noticed just on the web now, in the House of Lords, there's a bill being read to pardon him for crimes that were crimes in the 1950s that, of course, are no longer crimes. So now let me talk about John von Neumann. Von Neumann was also a European. He was from Budapest. He was born Neumann János, 1903. His family was a very wealthy family. He studied chemical engineering at ETH in Zurich, which was and is one of the top engineering schools in Europe. He the same time, he was interested in mathematics, and he was also working on a PhD in mathematics at a university in Budapest, where he got a PhD in 1926. Then he went to Berlin. He became a private docent at the University of Berlin. So a private docent is like an adjunct professor. So it's like a ticket to teach, but you have to get your students to pay you. He was there for 4 years, and he was very, very prolific. He wrote, you can see here it says he wrote 32 papers in 3 years. So these were apparently important papers. That's not my field, so I don't know. But almost 1 paper per month, which is amazing. Then he moved. He was invited to come to Princeton in 1930 to the math department, which he did. He taught for 3 years at Princeton, and then he moved to the Institute in 1933. And I say moved because it was the same building. So he may have just stayed in the same office and changed whoever his paycheck came from. He was literally a polymath. He made important contributions to many fields of mathematics. He's very well known, for example, for his contributions to game theory and its applications in economics. He was apparently quite a character. If you've been to the Peacock Inn, you may have seen this mural there. This is supposedly came up from the basement of the Peacock Inn, where there was a speakeasy before Prohibition was repealed. And this purports to be a picture of von Neumann driving in his car and reading a book at the same time. He was supposedly a very fast driver and had a lot of accidents. Okay? One of which was on Prospect Avenue, by the way. So why am I talking about him today? Well, he was a mathematician, as you saw. I didn't mention computers at all, but he became involved, like many people like himself, in the Manhattan Project, which was the American project to build an atomic bomb. He understood the equations that described explosions and things like that, and he got interested in computers through that because you needed computers to basically compute the solutions to these equations. So he studied many things in computers, what we call computer science today, in the 1940s. He also came up with a basic type of algorithm called a self-replicating system. It's also called a cellular automata, which is like a Turing machine, is a very useful computational model for various things, and also can be used for biological modeling of the division of cells and so forth. He also came up with other advances like random number generators and things like that we use all the time. He also consulted, as part of his work for the Manhattan Project, on the ENIAC project, which I think probably people know what that is. That was one of the first large-scale electronic computers, which was built at Penn in the Moore School of Electrical Engineering. And while he was there, this was not a stored program computer, but while he was there, he got involved with 2 of the computer engineers working on the ENIAC in designing an architecture for a stored program computer, which became known as the EDVAC. All computer names ended in ACK back in those days. And then he decided to develop a similar machine at the Institute. It had some improvements. This became known as the IAS machine. And it was completed in 1951. And this is a picture of that machine. There's von Neumann. This is Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of, he had been the director of the Manhattan Project and became the director of the Institute. And this machine was built in this building, which is over on Olden Lane, but not Olden Street, which is out there, but Olden Lane, which is over in the Institute property. And it was called the Electronic Computer Program Building, or ECP building, and now it's a nursery school. Okay, so when this picture was taken, they were inside this building. There were a lot of duplicates of the IS machine, so it was an influential early computer. The ILIAC, which was in Illinois, the MANIAC, which was in Los Alamos, and my favorite is the JOHNNIAC, which is named after John Neumann, and so forth. After the war, von Neumann, possibly because of his roots in Eastern Europe, was a Cold War hawk. So after the war, he worked on the hydrogen bomb. In 1955, Eisenhower appointed him to the Atomic Energy Commission. He also headed the committee that considered the feasibility of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were then developed, and the first ones were built in the late 50s. At the same time frame, he was diagnosed with cancer, and I don't know if bone or pancreatic, I couldn't find out from the biographies. And he was the next year awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which he had to accept in a wheelchair because of his illness. He died the next year at the age of 53. This is a picture of his house, where he lived in Princeton, which is down on Westcott, just off of Bayer Lane. Okay. I didn't take that today, you can tell from the sunshine. Okay, let me now talk about Claude Shannon briefly. And so Claude Shannon was not a European. He was born in Michigan in 1916, so we're coming up on his centennial in 3 years. He went to the University of Michigan, got a joint double degree in EE and math. Then he moved to MIT to work on the differential analyzer, which was an early analog mechanical computer. So this is the kind of computer that was sort of state-of-the-art at the time when Turing was thinking about his universal machine. This was a machine that was being developed by Vannevar Bush, who went on to have a lot of influence on, for example, the founding of the National Science Foundation and so forth. He got a master's degree in electrical engineering at MIT and then a PhD in mathematics. Now his master's thesis was very interesting because they introduced so-called Boolean algebra, which is the algebra of zeros and ones, to the analysis of logic circuits, which are the circuits that run computers. And this was very influential because today that's the technique that people use, that everyone in the field uses to analyze logic circuits. So it puts a mathematical framework on the design and study of logic circuits. And this master's thesis has been called possibly the most important master's thesis of the century. His PhD thesis was on mathematical genetics. So interestingly, all three of these people worked on some kind of biology. So they were working on mathematics and biology way back in the 40s, actually the 30s and early 40s. And of course now, these days, the use of computational methods in biology is one of the most important applications of information technology. But none of these people had much influence on that. They were working on this, but this work that they did didn't really lead to much of what we see today. In 1940, he came to the Institute to work with Herman Weyl on mathematical genetics as a National Research Fellow. This was also, the winds of war were blowing. There was wartime work was starting, even though this was before Pearl Harbor. He was seconded to an organization at Princeton called the Fire Control Research Office to work on military research. But at that time, he also started working on the theory of information, which is what he's really known for today. So, this is a letter. By the way, Shannon's papers are in the Library of Congress, and this letter is in his papers. This is a letter from Claude Shannon to Dean Eisenhardt. So Dean Eisenhardt was the dean of the graduate school at Princeton at that time. And this is a letter. Shannon's working at the Fire Control Research Office, which, by the way, is over here. It was on Nassau Street. This is Chambers Street, so you can see where this is. Okay. And he's writing a letter. I guess he's just saying what he did in the last so many months. Okay. You see, this is before Pearl Harbor. He said he spent some time analyzing the work done on the differential analyzer. So that's that analog computer. And studying the Tappert deflection mechanism, whatever that is. He also goes on to say he wrote a couple other reports. But the most important sentence here is the next to the last one. Some new research was done on the general theory of transmission and transformation of information. Okay, so at the time he was working here, Claude Shannon had started working on his information theory, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And by the way, Shannon lived here, 25 Palmer Square. This is a picture taken, it's a contemporary picture of it, but see, this is Ann Taylor here, so you can see where this is. That's the olive oil shop. Okay. But this was pretty new when he moved there Palmer Square opened in 1937, and I looked up and the rent was $36 a month for an apartment in Palmer Square. It's gone up. Okay, well, so what did Shannon do? Well, Shannon, first of all, in 1941, he moved to Bell Labs. Okay, so Bell Labs was in Manhattan. He moved to Manhattan, and Bell Labs hired him to work on fire control systems, which is what they were working on here, and cryptography. So these are military subjects. But at the same time, he continued to work privately on his theory of information. And we know this because of interviews with his girlfriend at the time, who lived with him in Manhattan. In 1948, he published a landmark paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. This was appeared in the Bell System Technical Journal. This is one of those papers that if you have an original copy, you can probably sell it for a lot of money at Sotheby's or someplace like that. And in that paper, he introduced a very simple model for the transmission or storage of digital information. So again, like Turing, something very simple, but it's had a major impact. And that model is built around this very simple diagram here of an information source, say a camera, or something like that, or a telephone, producing information that's transformed by a transmitter to be transmitted over a channel, say the ether, where it's corrupted by noise. The output of that channel is received, and the receiver processes it to try to undo what the transmitter did and what the noise, the effects of the noise, to deliver the information to its destination, like us. Okay. I'll talk more about this in a minute. This very simple model basically provides a basis for understanding a wide range of problems in information and communication technologies. And this has been called, his paper has been called The Blueprint for the Digital Age. So there's a lot in that paper and a lot he's done since, but he did afterward. But let me just try to give you a sense of two of the very important ideas that Shannon brought into this field. One of them is the notion of entropy. So there are two important pieces here. There's the source and the channel. Now, his idea about most communications engineers to that point had really thought mainly about the channel. That is, how do you get more transmit power? How do you modulate the signal to make it go through the channel and so forth? Single sideband, stuff like that. Okay, but Shannon turned his attention to the source, and his idea was that information is very closely associated with uncertainty. That is, if there's no uncertainty in the source, there's really no information in the source. Because if you tell me something, if I knew in advance what you're going to tell me, no information was conveyed. It's only if there's uncertainty in what you're going to tell me can you convey information to me. Okay, and so that was basic idea. And his idea was that we can determine uncertainty by looking at the minimum number of possible messages that it takes to describe the source. And he came up with a mathematical measure of that called the entropy of the source. So entropy is a term that comes from thermodynamics. You may know that the entropy of a matter has to do with how random and chaotic it is. It's the same idea. The higher the entropy, the more random the message is, the more information it contains. Okay. So one idea was that you could quantify how much information was in a message. And you could take a message and try to map it toward that minimum. And that process is called source coding or data compression. And that's the basis for things like zip on your computer when you zip up a computer file, things like MPEG, JPEG, MP3s are compressed versions of sources. And those actually, there are multiple kinds of compression. Zip is so-called lossless compression because you can unzip it and it's identical to what you put in. MP3s and JPEGs are lossy, that is, they're compressed beyond the entropy of the source. But because they're media, the brain can mask the distortions that are caused by that, by compressing beyond the entropy. Now, the other important part of this picture is the channel. Now, in order to transmit a source reliably, it's necessary to transmit it at the entropy rate. That is, you've got to get it all through. It generates information at a certain rate. That's the entropy rate. It has to go through the channel at that rate. Excuse me, or be distorted. But in addition to that issue, no communication channel is 100% reliable. You have noise, you have all kinds of interference. In a wireless channel, you have fading and so forth. So you have to add redundancy to the source in order to overcome the insufficiencies of the channel, and that's called channel coding. Every communication system has channel coding in it, and even storage systems like DVDs are heavily channel coded. So if you take a DVD and scratch it, you can still play the DVD because there's channel coding that codes over those errors caused by scratching. So a channel, like a source, a channel also has a fundamental property, which Shannon called the capacity of the channel, which specifies the maximum rate at which data can be transmitted through it. Okay? Today we call it the Shannon capacity. So these two notions, entropy and capacity, very fundamental notions that today guide designers of communication systems and data storage systems throughout the industry. We'll just wrap up Shannon, and I'll wrap up my talk. So after he invented information theory, he kept working on the field and wrote a number of other important papers in the 1950s and 1960s. He moved from Bell Labs to MIT in 1956 and retired in 1978. He was a little bit of an eccentric. He had a lot of hobbies: juggling, unicycle, chess, finance. He made a lot of money. He claims he did it by mathematics. There's a book called Fortune's Formula about this. He even invented a way that Americans could drive in England without feeling like they're on the wrong side of the road by putting mirrors around. He wrote papers about juggling. He received many honors. He lived longer than the other two people I talked about. He got the Kyoto Prize, National Medal of Science, and so forth. And he became a bit of a celebrity. So you can see here, it's a photo of Claude Shannon. This was taken by, you see here, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who is the father of photojournalism, very famous, influential 20th century photographer. And this was taken for an article about Shannon in Vogue magazine. Okay? So you can think about a time when Vogue magazine would write an article about somebody like Claude Shannon. It wouldn't happen today. Anyway, he was a celebrity. In the 1990s, he developed Alzheimer's, sadly, and he died in 2001 at the age of 84. And I was fortunate to meet Shannon. By the time I got my PhD, he had sort of dropped out of information theory, but he did show up at one of the International Symposia on Information Theory in 1985 in Brighton. And I was delighted to meet him, of course, and I asked him what he was working on, and he said juggling. So that's what he was working on. All right, so let me just wrap up now. Thank you for your patience. So remember, I started with this picture with all the alphabet soup on it, and now I just want to return to it and remind you of some of the people that we talked about. So we talked about transistors and integrated circuits, okay? Bardeen, inventor of the transistor. RCA developed CMOS manufacturing. Talked about software. Talked about, I mentioned Brian Kernighan, one of the developers of Unix. Claude Shannon, of course, algorithms, compression algorithms, Turing machine, von Neumann, self-replicating systems. Talked about wireless technology. I mentioned Tukey, inventor of the FFT, or the developer of the FFT. Shannon also had a lot to say about data transmission. Carson invented the first radio telephony technique. Display technology, George Heilmeyer, RCA. Imaging technology, L.A. Harari, and also RCA, CCDs. Networking protocols, David Boggs and Bob Kahn. Intellectual property, Jackie Madison. And services, Jeff Bezos, Eric Schmidt, and William. And then, of course, there are many, many other things that I didn't have a chance to talk about. So with that, I'm happy to stop and take your questions. Thank you.
Do you believe the environment for scientific innovation is as favorable today as it was in the day of the free trades? And what would you suggest about ways to improve it?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly the enterprise is much larger today than it was then. I mean, then science was carried out by a relatively small number of people in a relatively small number of institutions. Today, there are hundreds, just in the U.S., there are hundreds of universities with large research efforts going on. So, in some ways, it's much better than it was then. But I think there are some differences today. I think it's probably harder to study pure science than it was then. I think there's much more pressure. Those were before the days of federal funding of science, right? The institute was, and the university were both funded by philanthropy. All these people were being paid, being supported by philanthropic interests. So today it's mostly supported. Big science is supported by government. And I think there's more for that reason, the more accountability because of public money. So it's probably harder. It'd be harder for somebody like Turing, for example, to work on very fundamental things like he did. He didn't have to worry about that. On the other hand, like I said, the size of the enterprise is huge, right? And the economic impact has been so demonstrable that it's not hard to argue, particularly in a field like this, it's hard to argue for investment in research today. It's harder in some other fields, but in this kind of field, I think it's clear to the most obtuse politician that this is an important field for the economy. So it's a very interesting question. So, yeah,
You briefly mentioned Fairchild Labs. Can you comment just briefly on how that work done by that group and Shockey related to what was going on here and work by all these people you talked about?
Yeah, well, here, again, I've only talked about Princeton people, right? All these things had many, many people involved. I mean, the transistor, there were 3 people who won the Nobel Prize for the transistor. I only mentioned Bardeen because he's the only one from Princeton. The semiconductor industry moved to the West Coast largely. Of course, Bell Labs and RCA had a large impact on semiconductors, but later Intel and other companies, including Fairchild, started in Silicon Valley. That's why they're called Silicon Valley. And I think these people were largely transplants from the East Coast, but it built up. There was a good climate for it there. I think Bell Labs continued to have a major impact on the development of semiconductors, as did RCA, well into the modern period. I mean, it wasn't a complete capitulation to the West Coast, but certainly a lot of developments did happen out there. I mentioned also, in other parts of information technology, Xerox PARC, which was in Palo Alto, was another place where a lot of things having to do with computers were invented. And of course, ultimately, Microsoft, Apple, Hewlett Packard, you see all these companies developing on the West Coast. Other questions?
A few years ago, I had heard that we were losing our edge in research because we didn't have enough undergraduates going on for graduate work, and that a lot of foreign students were ending up coming here for graduate school and learning a lot, making the whole world progress. Have you seen any change in the kids going on to graduate school?
Yeah, well, first of all, the good news, I mean, we also had seen a decline in students studying science and engineering for a while. Now, the good news is that is over. Enrollments here in engineering are up like 50% over recent years, and that's true pretty much across the country. Graduate school, that's the undergraduate enrollment. Graduate enrollment, there's a lot of graduate enrollment comes from international students today. That, I don't know whether that's a concern or not. I think it's sort of an artifact of the fact that American higher education is so highly valued worldwide most of those students stay in the U.S. and become Americans. So if you go to Silicon Valley, for example, a very large fraction of the entrepreneurs are foreign born. I mentioned some of the people I mentioned, like Eli Harari is Israeli, John von Neumann was Hungarian, so even then, Alexander Graham Bell was Scottish. So, I mean, there's been a long history of immigration influencing at least technology development. So, I don't know whether that's a problem or not. It's certainly an issue to think about. Why is that happening? But it hasn't seemed to hurt us in terms of our competitive edge, mainly because the people who come here to graduate school largely are immigrants. They're not going to go back to some other. So it's like basically a brain drain. In some ways, we're bringing in intellectual talent from other countries, educating them, and they're staying here and creating new technologies, new jobs, new companies. So Google is another example. So, yeah.
When Bell Telephone was broken up, I guess it was during the Reagan administration in the 1980s. I guess it was at that time that Bell Labs started to get weaker or close. And I know they've received, people who work there received many Nobel Prizes and other wonderful recognition. Is there any current research area that has taken the place of Bell Labs?
Well, there's a lot of research done at Microsoft, Google, places like that. It's less fundamental than what was done at Bell Labs, I think. I mean, Bell Labs really was one of those places where, going along this question, where people could work on very fundamental things without worrying too much about where the money was coming from, because AT&T had a telephone monopoly. A certain fraction of everybody's phone bill was paying for Bell Labs. So there really, I don't know of any place like that today. There are a lot of our students go on to do research in industry, but it's not the same kind of, much more project-driven, short-term types of research. On the other hand, the breakup of Bell Labs, or the breakup of AT&T, and the subsequent effects on Bell Labs really had an enormously positive impact on technology development immediately thereafter, because there was a lot of intellectual property developed at Bell Labs which wasn't really being exploited. And when the monopoly broke, there was a lot of interest, there were more competitors out there who started exploiting those technologies. So the whole sort of cellular revolution was part of that. I mean, at the same time frame. It started, the first cell phones were, the first cellular networks were in the mid-'80s, early mid-'80s, the same time. And all those operating companies were the ones who developed them. AT&T, who owned Bell Labs, passed on cellular. And they only came back to it later. They bought a cell phone company. So AT&T Cellular, if you have AT&T Cellular today, it's not the company that started at AT&T. So I think it was a good thing when it happened, because it opened up like a Pandora's box of technologies that got out there and became commercialized. Now the question is, what's going to happen next? I mean, we don't have a place like that anymore, and I don't know how that's going to happen. I mean, it's not just in the U.S. I mean, it's true sort of worldwide. There aren't many places where basic research is a major investment, except in universities. So,
yeah, let me just follow on that, which is, where do you see this going? What are people working on at Princeton in the electrical engineering program, and what does it look like for the next 5 years, 10 years? You look out there. What do you see?
yeah, well, there's sort of two things. There's sort of technology or hardware, and there the trend is toward greater and greater miniaturization. Smaller and smaller and smaller, so you can put more and more and more transistors, for example, in something like this, and you can have more and more powerful computers inside small devices. Okay, but a lot more is being done in the area of software, that is applications. So machine learning is a really big area now. So Watson, the IBM computer, is basically a machine learning computer. And those kinds of algorithms that can take data and learn things from it that's a big area of application today. So you hear the word big data a lot, or data analytics, which is basically responding to the fact that there's many billions of trillions, even more bits of data that are being collected all the time, and in that data there's information, and so it takes a special methods to get that information out, and there's a lot of research today has to do with how do you do that. So that's a lot of that's happening here today. Those applications are throughout sciences and technology. I mean, they're not only for devices like cell phones, but also for biology, fields like that, neuroscience, and so forth.
One more.
Yeah, I'll let you choose.
Oh, no, you
don't. You had your hand up a couple times.
Your three greats had an interest in computing, electrical engineering, but also in biology. What do you see as the future of electrical engineering and biology merging, or sharing technologies?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of commonality between engineering in general and biology, but electrical engineering as well. I mean, materials, which is a big part of electrical engineering, is also of great interest to biologists. There's also, in terms of applications of biology, like healthcare, certainly electrotechnology has a lot to offer there in imaging, so things like MRIs, and in implantable devices and other types of things, so disease diagnosis and treatment. So today, you can think of pacemakers and things like that, which are sort of old technologies, but today people are working on things like very, very small particles, nanoparticles, that can deliver diseases, deliver diseases too. That's not what we're working on. They can deliver treatment to diseases. So, for example, cancer treatment, one of the issues is getting the chemicals to the site, without
I was sort of thinking about error correction and multi-level instead of digital, but just taking advantage of the biological systems that can work with high error rates and process that, whereas your computer comes up with a bad bit.
Yeah, so an very interesting intersection is between neuroscience and computer science, because the brain is organized like a computer of some sort. I don't think it's completely well understood. So there is a lot of interest in trying to understand that and use that to improve mechanical computers or electronic computers. Okay, so that's one way that I think biology and technology intersect in terms of what you call biomimicry, that is trying to design technological systems that somehow mimic things that biological systems do. But there are a lot of intersections. I mean, biology, 100 years ago was basically a science where you collected specimens and tried to understand how various animals related to one another. Since the 1950s, it's really been a quantitative science, right? Since the Watson and Crick era. And so as soon as you have a quantitative science, then you, like physics or chemistry, you can interact a lot more with applied fields like engineering. And there's a lot of that today. So I mean, it's probably the most important, in the 21st century, the most important development in engineering in general is sort of the rise of biology and the connections and the implications that has for technology.
Everybody here, I know, knows the term Wi-Fi, but I was just thinking that tonight, I think the very first time I ever heard it was in a public lecture, and I can't remember the year, would have been early 90s or mid-90s, perhaps, from Vince. And so we've all learned an awful lot of people of importance from the Princeton area, and thank you very much. Thank you.